The emergency pod hit atmosphere at an angle that suggested the vessel's AI had already given up on elegance and settled for probably survivable. Merrick Vale experienced the descent as a series of increasingly personal affronts to his inner ear, followed by impact, followed by the specific silence that comes after mechanical violence has finished making its point. He sat in the dark for approximately 30 seconds, conducting the internal inventory that separates people who've had safety training from people who panic productively. Everything moved. Nothing screamed. The pod had performed its single job, convert momentum into bruises rather than mortality, and Merrick unbuckled with the careful movements of someone who understood that adrenaline masks damage until you try to use the damaged parts. The hatch opened manually, which meant the power cells were gone or dead. Merrick stepped onto a landscape that looked like every geological survey photo ever labeled temperate zone, minimal interest. Rocky outcroppings, sparse vegetation, dirt in that particular shade of beige that suggests nothing dramatic has happened here in several million years. Two suns hung at different angles in a sky that was blue enough to promise oxygen and clear enough to threaten sunburn. He turned back to the pod and began the methodical inspection that protocol demanded. The emergency kit compartment gaped open, empty. The water storage, empty. The ration packs, medical supplies, beacon equipment, thermal blankets, all empty, all showing the clean removal marks of tools rather than the shredded chaos of impact damage. Someone had opened each compartment, removed each item, and closed them again with the thoroughness of a person conducting an inventory rather than looting a crash. Merrick found exactly two things remaining: the pod's structural framework, already cooling in the alien air, and a standard-issue multi-tool wedged in the maintenance panel. He pulled it free, checked the blade hinge and driver heads, and slipped it into his pocket with the emotional investment of someone filing a document. The situation presented itself with clarity. He was standing on an uncharted moon. The descent trajectory and star positions confirmed nothing in the commercial lane databases, with no supplies, no communication equipment, and no reasonable expectation of accidental rescue. The transport vessel he'd been traveling on had either survived its malfunction and assumed all pods lost, or hadn't survived and therefore couldn't report anything to anyone. The dual suns were beginning their descent towards separate horizons, creating shadow patterns that would take weeks to fully understand. Merrick gave himself approximately 3 days before dehydration began affecting cognitive function, perhaps 5 before it became irreversible, and a week before the question became academic. He spent the remaining daylight walking a perimeter, counting paces, noting landmarks, and generally behaving as if he intended to still be here when the details mattered. The pod had landed in a shallow depression with reasonable drainage and sightlines to several distinct rock formations that would serve as navigation references. The vegetation consisted primarily of low, waxy-leafed plants that clustered in specific areas for reasons he didn't yet understand, and tall grass-like stalks that rustled in the wind with the dry whisper of something that had evolved to conserve moisture. When the first sun set, the temperature dropped with the enthusiasm of an atmosphere that held heat poorly. Merrick returned to the pod, sealed the hatch as well as its damaged frame allowed, and sat in the dark, considering the specific flavor of his situation. Someone had removed his supplies. Not stolen, theft implied opportunity and haste. This had been methodical, complete, almost curatorial. They'd left him the pod for shelter and the multi-tool for capability, but removed everything that made survival simple. The implications settled over him like the dropping temperature. This wasn't an accident. This was something else entirely. He slept poorly, woke before dawn, and immediately began his first systematic project. The waxy-leafed plants grew in depressions. At first light, those depressions showed moisture, condensation collecting where cold air pooled overnight. The plants had evolved to exploit this. Merrick would do the same. He used the multi-tool to carefully pry loose several rectangular sections of the pod's interior paneling, selecting pieces that wouldn't compromise structural integrity but would serve as collection surfaces. The work took most of the morning. Angle mattered. Too shallow and the water wouldn't run to a collection point. Too steep and it would evaporate before gathering. He positioned 3 panels in different configurations, using rocks to prop them at varying degrees, and scratched notes on the pod's interior wall, using charcoal from a burnt-out circuit panel. Tomorrow's dawn would reveal which design worked best. He spent the afternoon walking a wider circuit, paying attention to topography. Water flows downhill, even on a moon with erratic rainfall. This remains true. He followed the subtle slope of the land, noting how the vegetation thickened in certain channels, how the soil changed color and composition. 2 hours into his search, he found it, a stream bed, dry now, but showing the smooth stone evidence of periodic water flow. The deepest point of the channel showed darker soil. Merrick selected a flat rock from the stream bed and began digging, using the multi-tool only when necessary to preserve the blade edge. The work was tedious, hot, and exactly as productive as persistence demanded. After 2 hours, muddy water began seeping into the depression he'd created. He let it settle, dug deeper, let it settle again. By the time he returned to the pod for the second night, his hands were blistered and his head ached from dehydration, but he'd created a muddy well that would likely provide drinking water once the sediment settled. Tomorrow he'd address filtration. Tonight he'd sleep and let condensation do what condensation does. Dawn brought approximately 200 milliliters of water across his 3 collection panels. The middle angle had performed best. Merrick drank half, used the rest to rinse the sediment from his hands, and felt the specific clarity that comes from a problem systematically addressed. It wasn't enough water, not for long-term sustainability, but it was enough for today, and today was the only timeline he could reliably engineer. The well had settled overnight into something approaching clarity. He drank carefully, small amounts, letting his body adjust. The water tasted of minerals and dirt and biological possibility. Nothing in his system rejected it immediately, which counted as success under current parameters. Hunger arrived on the 3rd day as a persistent static in his concentration. Merrick had been expecting it the way one expects weather, inevitable, manageable, potentially dangerous if ignored. He began the systematic catalogue of everything growing within walking distance, applying the toxicity testing protocol from his agricultural training with the kind of rigor that separates people who die from interesting plants from people who learn which plants are merely unpleasant. Skin contact test first. He rubbed small samples of each plant species against his inner forearm, waited 8 hours, noted reactions. Most produced nothing. One particular ground runner with purple nodes caused immediate numbness. He marked that area with a cairn of stacked rocks and moved on. Lip contact test. Small amount on the lips. Wait 8 hours. Observe. The waxy-leafed plants tasted astringent, but caused no swelling. A lichen growing on north-facing rocks tasted of basement and regret, but produced no reaction. Small taste test. Chew, don't swallow, wait 8 hours. The lichen remained unpleasant but non-toxic. The seed pods from the tall grass stalks had a faintly nutty flavor when crushed. Small consumption test. Swallow a small amount, wait 24 hours, monitor everything. The lichen processed without incident. The crushed seed pods, when soaked in his collected water, created a paste that his digestive system accepted with the resignation of an organism receiving calories from a non-preferred source. 5 days after landing, Merrick ate his first meal, lichen scraped from rocks, seed paste that required extended chewing, and water that tasted like minerals. He consumed it methodically while watching the dual sunset paint the landscape in colors that were beautiful and entirely irrelevant to caloric intake. He didn't celebrate. He made notes about digestive tolerance and planned tomorrow's expanded foraging radius. He also continued processing the long fibers from the grass stalks, twisting them experimentally, learning their tensile strength. Good cordage solved multiple problems. He'd need it. The pod provided shelter but no insulation, and nighttime temperatures were becoming a problem. Merrick woke on the 5th morning with joint stiffness that concerned him more than the hunger had. Hypothermia's cognitive degradation would be as fatal as dehydration, merely slower and more insidious. He couldn't afford the gradual theft of decision-making capacity. He spent the day gathering the dried grass stalks in quantity, bundling them into thick mats, using the cordage he'd been developing. Each mat went through multiple configurations. Thickness mattered, but so did air pocket distribution. He tested them by lying on each version, noting heat retention and comfort. Comfort was negotiable. Heat retention wasn't. He also discovered that certain dark rocks retained daytime heat significantly longer than others. Before sunset, he brought several inside, positioning them strategically around the pod's interior. The improvement was measurable. He slept better, woke with clearer thinking, and spent the morning weaving a door covering from plant material and pod framework that reduced heat loss while maintaining ventilation. Each modification went through the same process: design, test, refine, document. The pod's interior walls were becoming a technical manual, written in charcoal, tracking what worked and what didn't. By the second week, immediate survival had stabilized enough to permit territorial expansion. Merrick began systematic exploration in widening circles, maintaining sight of landmarks, creating cairns to mark routes. He used the dual sun's positions and shadow angles to maintain directional awareness, sketching crude maps on flattened bark. 2 hours east, he discovered a grove of fibrous trees whose bark peeled in long strips, perfect for improved cordage. He also found evidence of small fauna, droppings, disturbed soil, tracks that suggested something rabbit-sized and ground-dwelling. He began setting snares using his best cordage, positioning them along what appeared to be game trails between rock formations. The first snare yielded nothing. The second yielded nothing. Merrick adjusted positions, improved trigger mechanisms, studied the tracks more carefully. The 5th snare, placed at a natural bottleneck, captured a creature that resembled a scaled rabbit with too many joints in its legs. He killed it quickly with a rock to the spine, feeling neither satisfaction nor guilt, just the practical recognition that protein was protein and sentiment was a luxury for people with alternatives. He processed the creature completely, skin stretched for later use, organs buried, usable meat separated from bone, bones themselves saved for tool making. Nothing was wasted, because waste was a concept that required surplus. The smoking rack took most of a day to build, green wood from the fibrous trees, positioned over a slow fire of dried lichen and grass. The process couldn't be rushed. Rushed meant spoilage, and spoilage meant he'd killed something for nothing. The smoked meat represented approximately 3 days of protein, transformative for energy levels and cognitive function. Near the streambed, he'd found clay deposits. He spent an afternoon forming crude containers, learning through failure how thick the walls needed to be, how slowly they had to dry. The first 2 cracked in the fire. The third hardened into a bowl that was ugly, asymmetrical, and watertight. He made 3 more. 1 month into isolation, Merrick's existence had crystallized into routine. Morning water collection from the improved condensation system, foraging circuit through map territory, trap checking. He now maintained 7 snares in rotation, material processing, cordage, containers, tool improvements. The calendar system he'd scratched into the pod wall tracked weather patterns and seasonal indicators with increasing detail. He'd also begun constructing a secondary shelter near the tree grove, closer to multiple resources, better positioned for water collection, more defensible against the windstorms that were becoming frequent as the season shifted. The project proceeded incrementally, each session adding structural elements, testing stability, refining design based on what the weather taught him. Then he found the stones. They sat in a geometric pattern on a plateau he'd been mapping, too precise to be natural, too weathered to be recent. The markings carved into them had been softened by time, but the intentionality remained clear. Artificial, deliberate, ancient. Merrick spent an afternoon examining them, refusing to leap to conclusions, documenting everything with charcoal sketches. He found partial remnants of what might have been structures, or might have been unusually regular rock formations. The geology here was ambiguous in ways that frustrated systematic analysis, but the implications settled over him gradually, like sediment finding its level. This moon had been visited before, perhaps inhabited before, and his situation, the deliberately emptied pod, the survivable but challenging environment, began to resemble less an accident and more something with intention behind it. Test, experiment, study. The specific word didn't matter, the pattern did. Merrick didn't accelerate his work or change his approach. He continued building systems, improving efficiency, learning the terrain, but he also began creating his own markers, not messages exactly, not art, but evidence of systematic human presence and capability. Stacked stones marking water sources, carefully maintained trails, gardens of transplanted edibles arranged in efficient rows. If someone was watching to see what he'd do when supplies were removed, he'd demonstrate what he'd do, build supply chains from scratch, and document the process for anyone who came after. On day 47, during morning water collection, Merrick spotted the ship. It hovered at a distance, observing with the stillness of something recording data. He didn't wave, didn't signal distress, didn't interrupt his routine. He completed his collection, returned to his shelter, processed his gathered materials with the same methodical attention he'd been applying since landing. The ship maintained position for approximately 3 hours, then departed without communication. Merrick considered the implications. If they wanted retrieval, they'd have retrieved him. If they wanted to provide supplies, they'd have provided them. Their observation suggested assessment. He decided to be worth assessing. The ship returned periodically over the following weeks, sometimes hovering for hours, sometimes just passing overhead. Merrick continued his work. He expanded the water catchment system, using precisely angled bark channels that fed into his clay containers. He cultivated a proper garden plot, transplanting the most nutritious and reliable plants he'd identified, selecting seeds from the strongest specimens. He created improved tools with bone handles and hardened wood components. He built weather-resistant structures using techniques learned from observing how the natural landscape handled wind and rain. Each visit from the ship found him engaged in some productive task. He wasn't performing for them. The work needed doing regardless of audience, but he wasn't hiding his capabilities either. He simply continued systematically converting this section of moon into something resembling infrastructure. He created surplus, dried food stores that would carry him through seasonal variations. multiple shelters positioned across his territory, redundant water systems so that failure of one didn't mean crisis. This wasn't hoarding, it was engineering resilience, building buffers against variation and disaster. The ship's visits became less frequent but more prolonged. Merrick remained indifferent to their schedule, focused on his current project, cultivating multiple plant species with an eye towards selective breeding for nutritional density and growth speed. He'd even created a crude forge for heat-treating stone and bone tools, achieving harder edges and more durable points. 3 months after the pod had landed, his section of this moon resembled a functioning homestead. Water collection systems fed multiple reservoirs, garden plots produced reliable calories. Tool production had reached the point where he could create specialized implements for specific tasks. Weather-resistant shelters dotted his territory, each positioned for strategic access to resources. He'd mapped seasonal patterns well enough to predict when the stream bed would flow and when it would dry. The ship arrived one final time, but this visit was different. It landed. 3 figures emerged, bipedal and clearly non-human, wearing environmental suits despite the breathable atmosphere. They approached Merrick's main shelter slowly, hands visible and empty. He watched them come, continued his current task, processing seeds from his garden harvest, and when they reached conversational distance, he offered water from one of his clay vessels. They accepted, which seemed promising. The visitors examined his infrastructure with evident interest, making recordings, communicating among themselves in clicking harmonics that suggested language structure but conveyed no specific meaning to Merrick. One of them produced a data tablet, its display showing images that required no translation. Other pods, other species, scattered across this moon, and others like it. Many showed occupants still huddled inside, surrounded by debris and desperation. Some showed remains. A few showed similar infrastructure development, though none as extensive as what Merrick had built. The unspoken communication became clear through the simple grammar of images. This was indeed a test, though test implied judgment. These visitors didn't seem to be making. They were observers, documentarians, recording how different species responded when systems failed and supplies vanished. Most species collapsed. Some endured. Very few built. The visitors offered return transportation, gesturing toward their ship with the universal body language of invitation. Merrick considered his shelters, his gardens, his systems, everything he'd created from rocks and plants, and systematic observation. It represented proof of concept, demonstration of methodology. But civilization offered tools, collaboration, and accumulated knowledge. These plants and stones could never provide. He accepted the transport, but he spent his final day transplanting several species of his cultivated plants into a concentrated garden plot, creating a water system to sustain them through dry periods, and leaving markers explaining their edibility and cultivation requirements. Not for the visitors, they had ships and suits, and clearly didn't need his lichen paste. For the next subject deposited here, if one arrived. The ship departed GJ 447C with Merrick aboard, returning him to the transport network with profuse apologies from the commercial carrier, mechanical failure, unprecedented pod malfunction, deeply regrettable incident, and compensation that struck him as both inadequate and irrelevant. They offered counseling for the trauma. He declined and filed the incident report, with the emotional investment of someone documenting weather data. He returned to his previous life. Agricultural consulting, comfortable routine, reliable systems, but something had shifted in his approach. He designed with greater emphasis on redundancy now, questioning assumptions about what resources were necessary versus merely convenient. He taught methodology over memorization, process over protocol. His colleagues noticed the change but couldn't identify its source. Merrick didn't volunteer the story. It seemed unnecessary. Years later, 3 years, 7 months, another species pod malfunctioned over HFY-447C. The survivor emerged, found supplies deliberately removed, and faced the same desolate challenge Merrick had encountered. But this one discovered something Merrick hadn't: a thriving garden plot, with markers explaining water collection angles. Documented foraging maps, still visible in stacked stone cairns. Evidence that someone had been here, survived here, and left instructions. The survivor didn't merely endure. They built upon what Merrick had begun, adding their own innovations, creating new systems, leaving their own markers for whoever might come after. The moon was accumulating a library of survival knowledge, each species adding their methodology and observations to a growing repository of how to build life from nothing. The original observers continued their documentation, but their recordings now included a variable they hadn't anticipated. Humans, when stripped of supplies, didn't merely survive through desperation and instinct. They observed, systematized, and built infrastructure. And occasionally, perhaps uniquely, they left instructions for the next person facing the emptiness. The removal of every supply was meant to reveal something essential about survival capacity under extreme conditions. What it actually revealed was that humans considered survival the beginning of the project rather than the objective itself. Remove the supplies and they'd build supply chains. Remove the systems and they'd engineer new ones. Remove the context entirely and they'd create framework from whatever rocks and plants remained, then document the process for future reference. On a Tuesday afternoon, Merrick sat in his office reviewing agricultural system designs for a colony world nobody had visited yet. He incorporated lessons about condensation angles and lichen cultivation that his colleagues found oddly specific but undeniably effective. The designs included redundancy, others considered excessive, and resource mapping, they thought obsessive. He approved the final schematic and moved on to the next project, never mentioning HFY-447C, seeing no reason to perform the story. The systems he built simply worked better now because he'd once had to build systems from absolutely nothing. And somewhere, on a moon designated only by alphanumeric designation, his garden continued growing, tended now by a survivor from a species that had never before successfully completed this particular test. They'd found in carefully stacked stones and cultivated seed pods sufficient instruction to begin building their own answer to an empty pod and a silent landscape. The markers they left were different from Merrick's. Their biology prioritized different nutrients, their engineering solved different structural problems, but the methodology was unmistakable. Observe, systematize, build, document, persist. The observers recorded all of it, their data sets expanding in directions their original parameters hadn't predicted, documenting the strange human tendency to treat survival not as desperate endurance, but as the opening phase of infrastructure development.